Yeah, it's a real pleasure to be here, and the podcast experience was really fun, actually. I'm always nervous about those unstructured kind of situations, but I thought Ruth was very kind, and it was fun to do. And so I'll give you a bit of background before I get started too much. I'm a motivation researcher by training, like a disciplinary educational psychologist, as well as I was a practitioner educational psychologist in Vancouver, and then my first academic post at the University of Alberta in Edmonton. And somebody asked me, why'd you leave Canada? And then I said, well, this was yesterday, I said, well, it's snowing today in Edmonton, and so it's probably a place that it was great to be in, but it's amazingly cold in winter. But Vancouver is my hometown, and I do get to go back once in a while. But anyway, so I'm going to talk about our program of research on building motivation, blending motivation research and interactive design. And so this is kind of a confluence of things that I've been working on over the last few years. We're currently working on an ESRC project that will end in the end of October, and then we'll have some plans after that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about global teacher shortages, not very much about that, because I think that's kind of like everybody knows about that, and it's not something that you probably need to hear very much about. And then I'm going to talk about what motivation-based teacher recruitment is, and how we can kind of blend technology and motivation research to have one kind of thread that addresses teacher shortages in the UK and around the world. And I'll talk about motivational matching, which is hot off the press research that we just analyzed the data last week, and it's really exciting data and an interesting new arm of our work. So I want you to kind of just start by picturing this situation. So I'm going to give you a little scenario. It'll just take half a minute. A final year physics student is scrolling through a career guidance website, pauses on teaching for a few seconds, and moves on. She knows what teachers do. She has sat in a classroom for years, and she doesn't see a fit between her interests and what the job offers. And that moment, repeated thousands of times, is where teacher shortages are formed. In Europe, nearly 90% of countries report serious teacher shortages, and UNESCO projects a worldwide shortage of over 40 million teachers in the next decade. And these stats are often bandied around. And the core problem is not simply supply, but kind of a motivational misalignment. That's my argument today, that many high potential candidates never seriously consider teaching because whatever recruitment efforts are made doesn't engage how they think about careers and how they think about themselves and that fit. So the core arguments that I'm going to be making is that recruitment fails in part because it's too passive. Career decisions are motivational and personal. Interactive tools make motivation observable, and that's what I'll be showing you today. And that matching messages to individual motivation changes behavior. Let's just talk a little bit about the teacher shortages, and kind of, again, that's a picture you're probably aware of. We know that teacher shortages are variable. They change over time. Sometimes there are shortages, sometimes there are oversupplies. But the problem sometimes is that turnover contagion, that shortages bring about more shortages. And students aren't the only ones affected, and we know that teachers are also significantly impacted by teacher shortages because of increased workload, because of increased job demands, and overall lower morale. And so shortages can create a kind of a vicious cycle that affects the profession and the status of the profession as well. And it actually leads to people leaving the profession who are incumbent or are in the position. And this is the idea of turnover contagion. It's not just shortages, it's the fact that those who are in the profession are also vulnerable to some extent. And we know that fewer potential candidates are choosing teaching at this stage. And again, there's rumblings and noise that maybe the shortages will somehow change over the next few years with decreasing demand, for example, of school places and so forth. But we know there are serious structural problems and systemic issues in education in lots of different countries, and working conditions have really changed. We know that there are also motivational factors, that generational shifts, and Gen Z might have different career expectancies than previous generations. And I see this in my own children who are in their early 30s, who have maybe different career ambitions and different ways of thinking about balancing work and home life and so forth. And there's also this idea of knowledge deficits. And Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist Nobel Prize winner, talked about this "what you see is all there is" bias. And this notion that people make decisions very quickly based on incomplete information. And that's, I'm going to argue, true for our undergraduates or secondary school students who have sat in front of a classroom in front of teachers for 13 years and yet don't know very much about what teachers do. The main kind of approach to addressing teacher shortages has been financial incentives. And this is something that most governments and most institutions turn to when they want to address, and this is a crude tool that can be effective. My collaborator who was at Durham, now at Birmingham, Beng-Wat Si, and her co-authors at Durham, Stephen Gorard among them, recently reviewed the effectiveness of financial incentives and found that, yes, they are effective at bringing people into the profession, but that they're not necessarily effective at keeping people in the profession. And we know from kind of a self-determination theory perspective that extrinsic rewards aren't necessarily positive to kind of build that intrinsic appreciation or flourishing. And we know that there's an undermining effect as well, so that when we're offered money to do something, we will possibly do it, but it doesn't mean that we'll like it. And it doesn't mean that it'll continue in a positive. So financial incentives can undermine even that intrinsic motivation. And it's studied a lot in the last 30 years or so. It was called the reward paradox, and this notion that there might be an undermining effect of extrinsic rewards. But that's neither here nor there. That is certainly an approach to improving working conditions, and systemic and structural issues is a really important way of addressing teacher shortages. But I guess I'm trying to argue that it's not the only way. So the kinds of interventions that tend to be suggested and used across the world are things like passive scalable advertising campaigns. And you've probably seen Every Lesson Shapes a Life from the DFE, and they're really nicely done adverts, and they reach a lot of people. They're not very effective, and they're not expected to be very effective because they're really scalable. Hundreds of thousands of people see them. We hope that they influence or maybe nudge behavior in a small proportion of those who see that. And that's how they're designed. On kind of a higher effect size, less scalable, are things like taster sessions where, oh yeah, we know that if people get a taste or an experience of teaching, it's a pretty good intervention. It works quite well. The problem is that it's not very scalable. So not very many people get to kind of get into these events and make the effort and so forth, because it's a bit of a barrier to participate because you have to go somewhere and so forth. So what we're trying to work on is in that upper right-hand quadrant are things that are effective and scalable. And so we've kind of landed on this notion of different kinds of simulations that provide a representation of teaching that is realistic, authentic, and believable. And so that's kind of, I'll give you some versions of that today, and then I'll talk about our next steps and so on. So what we're looking at is trying to test motivation-informed interventions that are delivered through different kinds of technologies. And so people, especially young people today, make career decisions differently from previous generations. And according to kind of generational theories, and some of you will roll your eyes about theories of cohorts in Gen Z and so forth, but the notion of this kind of current cohort, or aging rapidly, of course, is that Gen Z job seekers look for authenticity, personal relevance, and opportunities to explore before committing. But it doesn't really matter if that's true of a whole cohort or not. It's certainly true that people today do look for authenticity in messaging and look for kind of cohort sensitive or ways of engaging with things that are probably digital and that probably individually address their particular motivations. And so we are building tools that are meant to be visually engaging, values-driven, and realistic, rather than kind of broad-based, single-message recruitment approaches. Motivation. So motivation is the reason that drives behind why people act in certain ways. It's looking at their goals, their values, their beliefs about what matters in particular behaviors, and what moves them or drives them to act and make, in this case, career decisions. And it's central to teacher recruitment. It's central to all kinds of career decision making, but people don't just choose teaching because of pay or conditions or structural issues. They choose a career because it reflects at some level their experiences, their goals, and their values. And yet the problem is that individuals respond quite differently to messages and have different values and goals. And so these kind of motivational messages, like the DFE's Every Lesson Shapes a Life, might inspire somebody to enter the profession, but it might leave somebody else quite cold. And motivations for career decision making, I'm going to kind of draw two categories, is this idea that we look at personal utility values as a motivator. So things that benefit the person, that might be career progression, or maybe holidays, or it might be the kinds of things that benefit them individually, or it might be social utility. And so these are values that you think about changing the world, essentially helping people. And these are kind of two broad categories that are motivators that I'll use as a kind of a theoretical framework from expectancy value theory. But we don't know very much about how to build kind of recruitment efforts or messaging that reflects these motivation categories. And that's where our work comes in. And we use simulations in recruitment because they offer a dynamic, interactive way to present, to allow candidates to express, to demonstrate their skills potentially, to experience realistic classroom situations. And these benefits are supported by all kinds of theoretical frameworks, like in social cognitive theory and situational judgment theory, which highlight how assessing and being exposed to real world behaviors can influence your decision making. And so you can build self-efficacy, for example, confidence about teaching by interacting with a realistic situation. And so I want to present some of our most recent work in using various levels of simulation to influence recruitment and retention. And so I'll start with something called realistic job previews, which are kind of static. They might use videos, but it's kind of like a one-shot scenario that, let me give you an example. We'll see if the video runs.
At the start of a lesson, one of your pupils, Tom, begins to eat a chocolate bar. You are aware that Tom has a tendency to be quite volatile. You tell Tom that it is against school rules to eat during lessons and that he must put the chocolate bar away. Initially, he does as he is asked. However, you later notice that Tom is trying to discreetly eat the chocolate bar throughout the lesson. At the end of the lesson, you ask Tom to stay behind for a break time detention. Tom refuses to stay behind and starts to walk past you out of the classroom.
Situation, and then there's some options in terms of how you should respond. I mentioned I did a podcast earlier, and I mentioned Nora McIntyre because when I moved to York from Canada, we were working on building an item bank of scenarios from classroom teachers who had various experiences. And Nora, I was just saying how I remember going to, I think, Skipton, somewhere far away from York, like in the Dales or something, where we went and interviewed teachers in a school to kind of start building this item bank of situations. And so all of our kind of scenario-based learning, our gamified recruitment tools are kind of based on this interaction with probably hundreds of classroom teachers in the UK, mostly in England, and so that's kind of the basis for the authenticity of the experiences. And so when we kind of did our first study looking at, in this case, attracting prospective STEM teachers, we used these realistic job previews, which would have been a video like that. And then there was, they would view 4 classroom scenarios. This was a COVID project, so sample size is quite small, and we were, everything was done online. Rate responses, write reflection and response, and then they received real-time feedback. And then they would get some kind of tailored feedback that was based on their response patterns. And so we would give them then fit messages, like, oh, excellent fit. You think just like a teacher. Your judgment matches closely with that of experienced teachers, because we had an item bank and we also had response options that had been scored. And maybe if they were not quite up to that, they were, you think like a teacher, your judgment matches quite closely, quite good fit for those who are scoring kind of in the lower region. We never said terrible fit, but some areas of fit were. Well, I kind of knew that if I was an undergraduate who got asked to do this, I would pick the worst responses by far. And I didn't think it was appropriate to say, excellent fit, you think like a teacher. And so we knew that there was a certain proportion who wouldn't take it completely seriously, and we didn't anyway. But that was our kind of lowest level of feedback, some areas of fit. And we found that this very brief intervention in the short term had an effect on interest in teaching. And so that was good. It didn't increase teaching self-efficacy. We also knew it was a really brief intervention. We didn't expect it to change the world, but it was kind of a proof of concept study that allowed us to think, okay, we're onto something that might be useful. We did the same thing over 3 periods of time in Australia, with a larger sample, and we could kind of look at how they changed in these from pre-session to session 1 and then session 2 and 3. And this was over the course of, I think it was a semester in an Australian university. And these were actually kind of pre-service teachers. They were in an education program, but a lot of them wouldn't have gone on to teaching. They might have gone on to careers in other things. But we could kind of show there that, yeah, there was at least, especially an initial boost in career intention. So are you interested in becoming a teacher? Although that kind of resolved back to the baseline by time 4. Perceived fit was kind of improved and stable. And then teaching self-efficacy, which had an initial high peak and then kind of declined, but was still an improvement after at the end of those 4 time periods, but from pre-session to session 3. We also then used that realistic job preview kind of to, now it seems like not primitive, but our kind of initial intervention with the DFE. And I could have updated this last night, but it's the same pattern. We don't get very good data, that's the problem. And so essentially we get, after completing this activity, which is 4 or 5 realistic job preview videos, we get some feedback from the participants, but we don't get to track them, which is what we'd really like to do, but that's not possible at this point with working with this group. But essentially, after completing this activity, I see a close match with teaching. These are people who go to the DFE website and can click on this to find out more. I'm interested in exploring teaching. I'm interested in training as a teacher. Okay, so that's fine. But it's just very descriptive, and it's a good sign, but it's not something that we can do very much with beyond that. So when we kind of had that completed, we thought, what engages undergraduates? And these RJPs, we thought, probably aren't going to be like really big hits with undergraduates, like who find them on their own, because it's kind of didactic and it's kind of a little bit boring and so forth. And we thought, what engages undergraduates? And most students today are gamers. 92% play regularly and 35% play most days. And the gaming stats, to me, are a little bit troubling, but 75%, according to this particular report, play 20 plus hours a week, which is quite a lot, I think. Although I remember in university, and I went to university, UBC in Vancouver, when I was, what year would that have been? Like in the early 80s. And we had video games, but like tabletop arcade games. And my goodness, I missed a lot of classes playing stupid tabletop arcade games. But I might have been in that 20 plus hours a week, even though now it troubles me. But gamification is something that we see as an entree, a way of kind of engaging undergraduates. And there's quite a bit of research on persuasive games. Certainly not very much in teacher education in terms of recruitment and so forth, but there's lots of it in the health fields, in other kinds of ecological approaches to learning about the environment and so forth. And so we know that gameplay and gamification is an approach where you can present simulations, in our case, classroom simulations, and depict what it is like in the classroom in a gamified way. And I should say that I was working on this project with people who were from computer science and arts and designs, or whatever the department was at York, but looking at, it was such a pleasure to get outside of the education silo and work with people who were working on game design and so forth. It was really fun. It was like the best interactions I think I've had in my academic career, just because it was refreshingly different and they weren't quite so caught up in ITE versus ITT or whatever it might be and so forth, like, arguments about language. It's like, yeah, whatever, okay, like, let's work on this. But anyways, that was, it was quite fun to work with that group. And so this kind of gives you the continuum of the interventions that we've worked on, and then I'll kind of talk about the some of the details. And so we kind of first started with like Teach Match, which was our a gamified teacher recruitment project where we developed TeachQuest, a game. And it's okay, it's kind of fun, but not that fun. And it takes too long and so on. We're developing a new approach to that right now. Recently, we've done a really quick 2 or 3 minute intervention where we're trying to like just interest people who come across something on social media where they might kind of look at social utility or personal utility approaches to teaching and the kind of the reasons and the benefits in a really quick, punchy way. And I have a colleague, Rebecca Snell, who's kind of been working in that area. And then we're working with, I know some of you have been visiting at Tübingen, but we're working with a VR classroom with colleagues at Tübingen. We just got some funding for that. And so we're looking, we are working on recruitment with that, but we're also looking at like dialogic teaching, and we're using AI-supported VR classroom where the students can interact and respond, and you can talk back and forth with them based on kind of what we input into our local large language model. And so and then TeachWorld is a metaverse thing that we'll see if we progress that or not. That's with a colleague at Education University of Hong Kong. But we're looking at the idea of interactivity, because with interactivity, there's that chance to have back and forth, to get responsive feedback in a way that you can't normally with your basic recruitment messaging. So static messaging can't really capture that process, and we can't really understand people's motivations if you don't get anything back from people. And so only interactive systems can kind of promote that kind of understanding of individual motivation. And so it makes it observable, in fact, and so that's what we're working on. So I'll start with TeachQuest, and that's kind of the big, for me anyway, ESRC project where I was talking to, I think, Ruth about the idea that we spend so much money on design and artists and writers and so forth, and now it's so much easier and quicker. If you want to put all the writers and designers out of work, you can use AI to create, really good tools, which we haven't done, but I can imagine everybody will be doing that. And, it wouldn't be great to be an artist or designer right now. But we're building and testing TeachQuest. So it's a visual novel style kind of game experience. Where you play it as a newly qualified teacher in the UK, and your first job is at a school in Sheffield. I think that was somehow chosen as the most neutral site it could be without offending people in the north or south or whatever. So it's like Sheffield, yeah, that's the answer. And you're in your first term, and the challenge is that you have to get through your first term. So you have to, and I'll show you some of the things that you come across. There's an aspect of autonomy where you make choices about what you do and how you respond and who you respond to. And so that's TeachQuest. We started with a game design and demo. It's browser-based, it's replayable, and it can be different. It kind of looks like this when you're playing it on a phone or on a desktop computer, which hardly exists anyway. But anyway, I don't know why we put that on there. But so you kind of deal with somebody. Here's Joe, whatever the scenario was, but you have some choices about how you respond. There's Abby, if I recall, because she's a troubled lass, and I remember you're working with Abby's father and things go terribly wrong and so forth. But this is kind of what the school looks like. Let's see if it runs. There's music as well, but sadly that probably won't work. So this is considered a visual novel style game, which can be popular format. The graphics would be clearer usually, but so you start and you this is your very first day. And I think that's probably enough. And then you have a mentor who provides you with feedback, and that's Jamie, and he observes what you're doing and gives you feedback on the choices you make, essentially. And then you can deal with your colleagues as well, and then you can make choices about who you interact with at Loxley High. And so it's not just about standing in front of a classroom teaching, it's also what you do between lessons, for example, and then you make some choices. So there's quite a bit of choice in their storyline, and then you interact at least in this way. And so you get some positive feedback from students, and sometimes you get some negative feedback from students. Etc. And then, so that was fine. We developed the game, and again, it's okay. We're developing a better one, but we did an experimental study that we just published last year with about 1,000 undergrads, and the conditions were a random assignment to teach Quest the game, to the realistic job previews that I showed you before that were more static perhaps, and to a game that one of our game designers had invented called Gravity Heist, which had nothing to do with teaching. And thankfully, it didn't improve interest in teaching or confidence. Or because we thought, oh no, like what if it's just like playing a game and then they respond? Because you never really know what's in your participants' minds. But anyway, so that was the comparison we made. And we had a pre and post test, and we measured these three motivation variables: interest, self-efficacy, and person, vocation, fit. So that perception of how well you fit with the profession before you played, after you played, and 6 weeks later. And we also measured their experience, so the meaning, like the sense of meaning they got from the game, mastery, autonomy, immersion, realism, and these weren't variables we would have included without working with game design researchers, so that was interesting. This is kind of the conceptual model, so I'll just show you TeachQuest and RJP, and then there was a control group. But and then the user experiences proposes mediators, and then these teaching-related motivations of structural equation models, sort of the starting point and the change in interest, fit, and self-efficacy. And so the findings were really good. Like we were able to show that teaching interest increased in a reasonably significant way. There was an increase in perception of fit with the profession, and we also, the RJP, but not the game, significantly increased self-efficacy, which was interesting. But the RJP gives more feedback, and the game didn't give enough feedback, and we're suggesting that probably that sense of feedback where you say, yeah, good job, you'll make a great teacher, can increase self-efficacy rather than the more neutral messages from the games. And in general, people kind of learn from the game and so forth. So that's the basic findings over time, that we saw reasonable increases in terms of, these were undergraduates from across the UK who we controlled for teaching interest, of course, at the beginning. And so we were able to show that, yeah, there's a good increase for both TeachQuest and for the RJP, and for Gravity Heist, no change, which was great. We also had a qualitative component, which I won't analyze here, but I'll just give you examples of the comments. So these are, slightly weirdly the game characters, but this is what our participants, our players said. Yeah, it's realistic, they're up to mischief, but it felt real, essentially. It's not a perfect view of teaching because we were really going for this sense of authenticity. It's not a perfect view, you can get it wrong. I like seeing it and this was so important for me anyways, because I wanted to kind of get that sense for our players that they would learn something about what it's like to be on the other side of the desk. And so, and again, that what you see is all there is, cognitive bias. And, we've also done work on kind of this information deficit that secondary school students and undergraduates have about teaching, that we think or they think they know about it, but it's like, oh, it's not an insight I've had before. And related to that is, yeah, there's a lot more variety to the job than I thought. I thought it was just marking. It's like, yeah, we teachers don't even mark, really. No, they do. It's a big part, maybe, or I think it's a lessening amount of work. Okay, so that's kind of the basic kind of technologies that we developed so far. And just for the last 10 or so minutes, I want to talk about motivational matching, because this is kind of the next step. These were still kind of static. There was interactivity. There was a chance to make decisions. The messaging was aligned to what their response patterns were. But when we're talking about motivational matching, it's a persuasive but not a manipulative approach that involves tailoring messages to match the motivational underpinnings of participants. And so it's not manipulative because it provides information about the job. It doesn't attempt to deceive, it attempts to inform. And so that's what we are working on currently. And it's kind of a hot topic in motivation research, where we've just given, and especially in whatever kind of persuasive motivation research, where you want to have a message that does something, this idea of matching to individuals, and it has been used for years in advertising in various ways. You know, an advert might be targeting this particular demographic sector, and you certainly see that in, if you have, sadly, like, my social media evil is YouTube, and you know, like when I need a break on YouTube, and it just gives me everything that I'm interested in, and it's perfect. But it's kind of like that, but we're looking at matching for motivation. And so we know that most recruitment messages are generic, and that interactive experience can help us tailor the messages to what people value, and that we can also correct misperceptions about the profession and strengthen that perceived fit. Let me give you an example. So Joe's main motivation is personal utility. They care about pay, job security, progression, and flexibility. Okay, it's like a personal utility message, and people might say, okay, that's one kind of category. Daniela's motivation is social contribution and meaning. She cares about changing lives and making a difference. And so these are the kinds of messages, well, this is just a description of motivation matching. And it kind of matters, because messages that reflect people's motivations are more likely to shift attitudes, intentions, and behavior. And so we know that motivational matching, there's this really big meta-analysis done with 700 studies by Joël Desmarais, a Canadian from Laval University, who looked at tailoring messages and what the effects of tailoring were in terms of general persuasion, and found a really significant effect size, like R equals 0.2 is meaningful, especially when it's scaled to a population. And so that's like a Cohen's d of about double that, so 0.4. So it's kind of a small to medium but meaningful kind of effect. And it can be tailored to individuals or demographic groups. So when we're applying motivation matchings in simulations, we can match to personal utility about progression and so forth. We can match to social utility about how meaningful teaching can be to children and so on. Or you can also, we've done some work on matching to intrinsic motives, about enjoyment, about the intrinsic benefits of teaching. And it can also correct biased beliefs about salary and the nature of the work and so on through our realistic kind of portrayals of teaching. And so in the study that I'll talk about now, this was kind of the conceptual model of what we're looking at. So we had messaging where we wanted to match based on advert choice. So there's a study done by Martz in 2025 that looked at persuasion in recruitment in other fields. And they used these ads that were I think they were personality driven. That was kind of like, one was conscientiousness, one was whatever, I don't know, extroversion or whatever it was. But we kind of used it as a ad choice to promote PU and SU. And we gave people a choice, and we tested it in a pre-test, in a prototype kind of study where we wanted to look at whether it was a reliable way to gauge people's kind of motivational profiles. And then we looked at various teaching values, and then again we looked at teaching motivations. We also looked at behavior. So we looked at whether, depending on the condition, how people reacted to a choice to find out more information about teaching, to click on a button. Would you like to find out more about teaching? And then we measured how long they stayed in that particular website. And this is sort of the study design again. So we had a pre-test that measured all the motivations and so forth. We gave them the SU and PU advertisement, and then we tracked them, we divided them, we matched them according to SU and PU. And then, so we had like, let's just say half of them preferred the social utility advertisement and half of them preferred the personal utility advertisement. And then we gave them messages that were either matched. So if they were a social utility person, we would say, oh yeah, teaching's so great, you really help people, it's lovely, and so on. Or unmatched, which would be a PU message, which would be like, teaching gives you career progression. It's really great for climbing the ladder and for taking care of your family and so forth. And we did the same with the PU people. And then we tested post-test, and we had a delayed post-test after that. And so these were the adverts. So you get a sense. So these are these things that divided them according to SU and PU. And the question was, imagine you're looking for a job, which advert's more appealing? And they weren't having to do with teaching at all. So, and we validated these by using social utility and personal utility scales as well in the pre-test and so forth. So we knew that they were kind of at least correlated quite strongly with kind of existing measures, even though it's kind of a different approach. And so what we found with the study then is, first of all, that motivation matching increases interest in the behavior of looking at more teaching information. So when we matched the social utility with the social utility messages, so this group and PU matched group, we were able to show that that compared to the unmatched, they had higher levels of information about teaching. So, I think percentages. Okay, so 42% of social utility want to find out more about teaching, and 43 or whatever it is for personal utility, compared to the unmatched group, which was lower. Okay, so that's interesting. And then we looked at the engagement behavior, and that this actually shows the same thing. So this is actually duration. The previous one was whether you clicked on the button to find out more or not. This one was how much time you spent in terms of seconds. And we're not super confident about this data yet, because there's a couple of people in the matched one who spent like 6 hours on it, and it's like, it's one page. Like, I don't think you're really reading this for 6 hours. They left and went to work or whatever and came back. So that's data from, 2 days ago, but we'll see about that one. But actually a little bit more interesting for us was this idea of interaction. And so when we had the unmatched group, which is the social utility group, which is the square, perceptions of social utility didn't change across conditions. And so, because this is a measure of change, we actually saw social utility kind of more or less stayed the same, but when they had an unmatched message. But when we gave the unmatched message to the personal utility group, so that means that they value career progression and whatever personal utility things we included. When we gave them a social utility message, it really increased their interest in teaching. And so matching kind of works in terms of increasing their behavior, so they would click on a website about teaching, but we could really increase the, in terms of those who were really personal utility oriented, providing the opposite message was effective in changing their interest. And so kind of like for those who preferred the PU advert, however, exposure to PU content didn't really, it strengthened the perceptions, but it meant that these personal utility aspects of teaching, like job security and career progression, might be less salient or less well understood. But we know that for the social utility group, the PU, I hope I made it right. just wait. By comparison, the perception of teaching as socially valuable appears. So perceptions of social utility did not change across conditions. It was, in contrast, the personal utility perceptions were more malleable. So for participants who initially preferred the SU advert, exposure to PU content, which was unmatched, increased their perceptions that teaching fulfills personal utility kind of motivations. And so that was the group that was most likely to see benefit. And we saw that also in the interaction on time 3, that perceptions of social utility didn't change for either group by time 3, meant that it was kind of already established. And so it reinforced the idea that SU beliefs about teaching are relatively stable. So for participants who initially preferred the social utility advert, exposure to personal utility content, which was unmatched, increased their perceptions that teaching fulfills personal utility motivations, and that effect persisted at delayed post-test, but it didn't change more than it had over time too. So we think that in general, that matching might produce like an immediate kind of effect for certain groups of people with certain motivation profiles, that mismatched exposure may prompt reconsideration and lead to more sustained changes. And so we're still toying with this. And again, this data is from like Friday or Saturday or something. And so forgive me for stumbling through it a bit, but we're kind of looking at how we might kind of explore that idea of matched versus unmatched, and why we see behavior changes when it's matched, and how we can increase some groups through having mismatched kind of advertising. In general, we also had a third condition, which was mixed, which we haven't really analyzed yet. But it may well be that kind of a mixed message benefits everybody, but we can't say anything about that yet because we haven't really looked at it very carefully. But that is the gist of my talk, and this is the group I work with. That's my research group there. Just kidding, there's 3 of us, but it's at a conference. And these are some of the projects that we're working on. So thank you very much.